Kia ora, everybody. Welcome. On behalf of philosophy at the University of Otago, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Taylor Lecture. It's our second Taylor Lecture in a row, and we're very pleased tonight to be able to welcome David Braddon-Mitchell. So just, if you don't know, the Taylor Fund was given to us by Dan and Gwen Taylor, who both taught here between 1960 and 1982. And it's their very kind gift that has allowed us for over 30 years to bring in top-notch luminaries from around the world to do philosophy with us, and we're thrilled to have that again tonight. So welcome very much. So tonight we're welcoming David Braddon-Mitchell, who is a professor at the University of Sydney, professor of philosophy. He has held posts in Auckland and was a research fellow at the Australian National University. David's areas of research are wide, but they are mostly in mind and metaphysics, branching out into philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, quite a lot of physics from what I can see. He has been the recipient of numerous ARC grants and is the author of The Philosophy of Mind and Cognition, co-authored with Frank Jackson, who some of you may have heard of. He's more recently published Armstrong's Materialist Theory of Mind with Oxford University Press in 2022. And Conceptual Analysis, I can't read my own handwriting. Something about it's great. Conceptual Analysis and Philosophical Naturalism from MIT in 2009. And his top hit paper, which I like very much, is called How Do We Know It Is Now? Published in Analysis. So tonight we're very pleased to learn about AI consciousness and neo-feudalism from David. And he'll talk for about 55 minutes, then we'll have some questions. And afterward there is a reception which everyone is invited to attend and continue to discuss. So, David.
So this is a talk with two themes. One of them is broadly political philosophy. In fact, when one of my colleagues at Sydney saw the advertisement, she raised up me excitedly and said, "David, you've seen the light. You've moved over to political philosophy." And the other is kind of more centrally in philosophy of mind, the question of consciousness and even more crucially, what it would take to have genuine thought in an AI. And I will leave you to decide if I successfully meld these things together and bridge the gap. I like to think that I have, but you will perhaps take a little time coming. So let's start. It's the 9th century. The Carolingian Empire is losing central control of broadly France and areas around it, and they're unable to raise enough troops. And they're unable to provide enough resources to consistently have the kind of imperial control that they want. So what happens is they start to outsource to local grandees. And the local grandees exert control over people to grow food and people to be cannon fodder. And they connect with the Central Empire by the Central Empire giving them support against any local insurrections such as they are, in exchange for providing those troops and providing some resources. And so those local grandees, this is the main part of the deal really with the Central Empire, end up owning everything. Pretty much nobody else does. Now what are the estimates? The estimates are between 1% and 5% of people own essentially everything, and everybody else is a kind of villain, spelled with an E-I-N, not an A. And those people are basically tasked to grow food and be cannon fodder. Doesn't sound great. But there's one critical thing about it, which is perhaps not so terrible, at least by the standards of the worst things you can imagine. And that is, although possibly the people who are growing that food are in a worse state than peasants who actually own some land, they are at least required. The local grandee really does need them to grow some food. And they really do need excess people to be cannon fodder. And if you have to grow some food, you've got to eat some food, otherwise you can't grow it. And if you have to have enough of a surplus population so as to provide cannon fodder, then the standard of living has to be above the absolute bare minimum, because you've got to be able to have children, have a number of children, have some of them grow up to grow food, and have some of them become cannon fodder. Now, if you were to read a careful history of the Carolingian Empire and its successors in the early Holy Roman Empire, you would read a lot of stuff about the complex relations of mutual obligation between the clergy and the villeins and the lords and all the rest of it. So what I've just described is a bit of a caricature, but statistically, there's something right about it. It was depressing and it was bad. Okay, things change. So by perhaps starting in the 1930s, perhaps ending in about the 1970s, if you believe Thomas Piketty in his book Capital and 21st Century, eventually inequality of ownership of resources, not of income, reaches a kind of a global minimum around about 1970. In the late 19th century, that kind of magic 1% story where 1% of people own most of the stuff is applying again. But it starts to change for all kinds of cool and complicated reasons that if this was a different talk, and I knew some more about it, I would be able to tell you about. But all that matters for us is that it does change, and the change appears to be in reverse. Piketty estimates that in perhaps 10 to 30 years, we could be back to that depressing magic 1% figure. I don't know whether he's right. The arguments are fairly plausible, but they're highly contested. But a continuous theme of this talk is going to be, we don't need to be sure of some of these things. We just need to think they're plausible enough for it to matter a lot for what we plan to do. So let us suppose then that in perhaps 30 years, we're back to that situation where most of the resources are owned by a tiny number of people. How much like the feudal past is that going to look? So you don't need to be sure Piketty is right to ask that question. Now, what's that got to do with AI? This is what it's got to do with AI. It seems to me that there's a scenario in which how things are in 10 or 20 years, that's assuming that we don't have a climate change disaster. That's assuming that the worst paranoid science fiction stories about what AI will do to us are untrue, which they may not be. So assuming all those good things, the combination of artificial intelligence and the drift to more and more central ownership could make things way worse than they were in the feudal era. Here's why. In the feudal era, as we've discussed, people were required to grow the food and be the cannon fodder. Now, if AI's capabilities increase at the rate that they do increase, and I'll talk later about what it would take for that to happen, and if Piketty is right about the concentration of ownership, and I hope he's wrong, and I think there are ways we can make him wrong, but whether we will is another question. But if both those things happen, what we'll have is a set of resources in the hands of a small number of people which give them everything they want and need. They won't need 99% of the population to grow the food. They won't need anyone to be cannon fodder. Essentially, most of us will become surplus to requirements, or at least the requirements of those who own almost everything. So how replaceable actually are we? And how likely is it that that scenario where people can get all they want from vast automated farms and vast automated factories and vast automated public services and vast automated systems, how likely is that to be true? Well, of course we don't know, but even as things stand right now, it doesn't look great. You might think, look, surely people are still going to have their kids taught some philosophy. So there's a job for us in this room, at least some of us in this room, right? Well, I suspect there's a sense in which that's not going to be true even in a few years' time. So teaching theorists estimate that it's about 8 times as good to be taught one-on-one as it is to be taught by a very fine teacher in a classroom. Now, let's say I'm, slightly egotistical about my teaching skills, and I think to myself, I'm 4 times as better as the AIs of 3 years' time in teaching. But the AIs can be one-to-one, anyone who wants them. That makes being taught by the AI 4 times as good as me. My university has already started automating us. So there are a few members of staff at the University of Sydney whose publications have been absorbed into a sub-licensed version of a large language model, whose curricula have been absorbed by the same sub-licensed version of that large language model, and the students can then ask questions of the LLM, which is like a copy of the lecturer, and actually they're remarkably plausible. It's only out for volunteers at the moment. I have not volunteered. But it's coming to a university near you. A university in Melbourne that I can't name because I only know about this through back channels, is moving to a process of taking all the readings for all courses and having them absorbed into a sub-licensed version of GPT, so that students will be able to ask any question about any subject and they'll get some sort of answer which is much more relevant than you would get if you just went on to ChatGPT as it now stands. Ten years ago, my general practitioner said that he mostly agreed with his automated diagnostic software, but when they disagreed, he was right. He now says when they disagree, he's never right. The AI is always right. I have a friend who, Brian O'Connor, runs O'Connor Consultancy, who some years ago employed a quite large number of people, partly writing websites and doing work like that. He now employs nobody. He draws a little sketch diagram what he wants it to look like. He tells the robot what he wants everything to do, and all the coding is kind of done for him. Until 2 or 3 weeks ago, there's a bit of work to be done debugging it and fixing it because it made mistakes. You had to talk to it. But since the latest 0.1 model came out, there's no more work to do. It comes out just fine, the way really expensive coders would do. It used to be in Sydney, I don't know what it's like here, that law firms would outsource low-value work to lawyers trained in Australian law in Mumbai to save some money. They don't do that anymore. They outsource it to AIs. And increasingly, everything reasonably simple, like contract writing, is being done by AIs. One astonishing example I know of is a company which used to have 5 or 6 senior executive officers. They had a chief financial officer, an operations officer, and this, that, and the other. And the owner of it decided to get rid of them all and run an AI system that did it all. That didn't work. But what he discovered was he had a separate AI system for each of those officers and forced the AIs to email each other. It worked just fine. Every now and then they would say, shouldn't we consult the human about this? And it would all work. And that was 5 very senior administrative positions down the tubes. So I went to do a bit of research in areas in which there's been massive job loss due to AI. And you can imagine the usual story: manufacturing, retail, warehousing and logistics. There are no office blocks full of people working on logistics anymore. That's all changed in the last 6 months. Customer service. It used to be that those annoying bots that you talked to were hopeless. Like in the last month, essentially. If you're lucky and you hit an annoying bot, it won't be an annoying bot. It'll be in a bot that knows more than the person you might otherwise have been connected to, which is both good and extremely depressing at the same time. Used to be that lots of people made a lot of money out of being traders. Now a very small number of people make a hell of a lot of money out of owning automated systems that do trading. And that's now. We're at the very beginning of all of this. So it seems to me not implausible that at the practical level, all of this might become sufficiently powerful that we do face the possibility of the world where we are surplus to requirements. Well, this might all sound a bit familiar to you. You might have thought you've seen it before. So you might have seen Marx's argument in the 19th century about the crisis of capitalism. And he was wrong about this. What he thought was this: there's an incentive to automate, so we will automate, so we're going to need fewer people, but that means fewer people will earn wages. And if fewer people are earning wages, they won't be able to buy the stuff that we're producing by our automated system, so there'll be less demand. And because of that, the capitalists will expire. They'll be sort of self-defeating. Each individual capitalist has a powerful incentive to automate, but collectively they all end up broke because no one can buy what they produce. Incredibly cool argument. I remember I spent a lot of time wondering why it never happened. Why didn't it happen? Well, it didn't happen in part because of a massive move to intellectual labour. The automation that happened in the Industrial Revolution and through most of the 20th century essentially replaced physical labour, but it created lots and lots of intellectual labour, which meant that, to a large extent, you didn't get the kind of mass lack of employment and mass lack of salary that would result in the capitalists going broke. So the capitalists did pretty well out of this. That's why it kind of didn't happen. So why should we not hope that the depressing story which I was telling you about won't happen? Why should we think that might not happen? Well, two things to say about it. One is, I don't think that my story, unfortunately, has a depressing end for the owners of the tech. Because on Marx's story, the owners of the tech were basically making one thing, right? They're making widgets, and they had to sell the widgets in order to fund everything else. But on my story, the owners of the tech own the tech that make everything they need, so they don't need to sell any widgets. So there's no pressure on the owners of the tech to make sure that there are people buying their stuff, because they just have to make the stuff. That's one reason. And the second reason is it's much less clear once the intellectual labour is automated, and that's the fear of AI, and maybe robotics will get rid of some of the other physical labour. It's much clearer where the extra jobs might be. They might be in personal services and butlering to the rich, but that is not a niche that the vast majority of people are going to be able to fill. No one wants 10,000 personal assistants. So I think that while Marx's predictions didn't happen, mine might. All right. Are there any causes for optimism? Let's hope so. Here are two. Maybe the owners, with a capital O, I should write a science fiction novel about the owners, shouldn't I? Maybe the owners like kind of vanish into their own life. Once they can make everything they want, they'll just leave everyone else alone. And when they've left everyone else alone, then the remaining people may acquire or create or steal some AI tech too and be able to make stuff and do stuff, and it'll end up messy and complicated and dystopian, but it won't end up as mass starvation. That's one hope. That the owners don't decide that the rest of us are a nuisance and need to be gotten rid of. And the other hope, which is even a nicer hope, is that you might think that becoming an owner in this sense will change the incentive structure so different kinds of people become powerful amongst the owners. What do I mean? Well, there is a bunch of evidence that people who are very senior in corporate America, at least, are much more likely to be psychopaths than anybody else. So there's the Clive Body's fabulous 2010 study, what's it called? Corporate Psychopaths, Conflict and Employee Effective Wellbeing, suggested that about 20% of CEOs are psychopaths. And you can see why that would be, right? It's actually a very helpful psychology to have if what you want to do is get to the top of a large corporation whose job is essentially only earning money. So you can imagine that what's making it true that there are a lot of psychopaths in large corporations is the incentive structures of large corporations. Now, maybe if large corporations are amongst the owners, and if you're no longer driven by making a profit because you've got stuff that will do everything you need to have done, there'll be less of an incentive structure for psychopaths to run the show. So maybe, influential amongst the owners will be people with a more humanitarian approach and are more interested in reorganizing wider society so that, they might be able to use tech for the greater good of people. But I wouldn't want you to bet your futures or the futures of your children, for those of you who have any, on this little piece of hopefulness, right? It's a wild speculation. A lot of it's wild speculation, but it's a nested wild speculation which might or might not be true, and you really don't want to rely on that. So the only, I think, moderately plausible way to head off this is to try to bring it about within the next 10 or 20 years that fully automated tech, AI tech, is either socially owned or socially controlled. It needs to be there to do things for the benefit of all of us rather than for those who own us. And that instead might push us towards a post-scarcity society rather than a neo-feudal society. Even then, there are really interesting questions like, what is life like for humans who don't have to do stuff? Would I care about philosophy if I thought I could never add anything to it because the AI philosophers were way ahead of me and I could hardly understand what they were doing? So I would spend my time maybe studying the greats, either the dead great humans or the great AIs. How much of what we do depends on some sense that we're looking after ourselves and our loved ones, and how much of our motivations are based on the intrinsic nature of what we do, I just don't know. Cool questions. Other people have discussed them. Let's not go there now. But it sounds a whole lot better than the neo-feudalist future. So that's kind of part one. If this tech becomes much more potent than it is now, then it's going to need to be socially controlled, or there's a serious danger that most of us are surplus to requirements. Okay, how likely is it? What kind of tech would be powerful enough to do this, even given how powerful what we have now is? So I want to do two things here. Firstly, I'm going to confess to some bait and switch. I'm not going to talk a great deal about consciousness, but I will talk a little bit about consciousness. But I will go on to talk a lot about what it takes to be a genuinely thinking thing and to have genuine beliefs, because that's what will create, what is required for what's called, automated general intelligence, a truly thinking AI system. And it's a truly thinking AI system that is what we should be maximally worried about in terms of either the science fiction apocalypses or my neo-feudalist apocalypse. But first, a few words about consciousness. So there are many, many different theories about consciousness. Now, I'm going for tonight to assume, and some of you won't share this assumption, that it's at least in principle possible to have conscious beings that are purely physical. Maybe some of you think that it requires some extra non-physical stuff to be conscious. That's a long debate. We can have it another time. I'm going to assume that it's true. But I'm just going to mention a few of the theories about what it takes to be conscious, because it looks like on most of them, we are either there or almost there. Now, I'm not sure that they're correct theories, but if they were. So here's the first. It's the so-called global workspace theory of Bernard Bears and, in more detail, Stanislav Dehaene. According to the global workspace theory, what it takes to be conscious is, in addition to having a vast store of information, and in addition to having various bits of data coming in, perhaps via the sensors, perhaps other sources, there needs to be a central clearinghouse. A central clearinghouse in which only the most relevant data that is required for what you're currently doing is kind of stored. And that central clearinghouse needs to be massively interconnected in various kinds of ways. That, according to these guys, is what consciousness is. What you're aware of, what your awareness is on this theory, is this kind of central clearinghouse. You know tons of stuff, you're not aware of most of it. You're having endless sensory input, you're not aware of most of it. But a system select the most important bits for the decisions you're making, and those bits put together, that's what consciousness is. Now, ChatGPT is not conscious, doesn't mean that if you think about the whole thing, the vast network. But you shouldn't think about the whole thing. Instead, you should think of there being millions of instances of it, namely the ChatGPTs that probably most of you had discussions with sometime today. Am I right? Who's had a discussion with ChatGPT today? Yeah, most of you. So each of those instances that you've chatted to today has two sources of information that it keeps salient at all times. One is the history of your chat, and the second is the global memory of your account. The global memory of your account is restricted to about a page and a half, 2 pages of data, and there's the allowable chat length varies, but it's no more than 15,000 words. That stuff's, as it were, kept in a kind of global center, and anything you say to it goes into that global center, and those things are salient for what it's got to do next, which is usually just tell you some stuff. So you might think that even ChatGPT is already not one, but many, many millions of little tiny conscious agents, at least if the global workspace theory is right. You might just think this shows the global workspace theory is not a good theory. So here's another somewhat controversial theory, Tononi and Koch's IIT, or integrated information theory. The integrated information theory says that what consciousness is massively high level of integration of information. So if you've got a whole bunch of information stored separately, it's not conscious. But if it's all available to each other and interconnected, that's what makes something conscious. So once again, there are measures according to which you can do the magic numbers that these IIT people have. They have a measure of consciousness. They call it a consciousness meter, depending on how integrated the information is. I think it's bollocks, by the way. I've written a paper saying it's bollocks, but a lot of people believe it. By that measure, it turns out that ChatGPT already passes it. So hat tip here to my graduate student, Nikki Weiss, who's done some work on IIT and LLMs, which says that by the standards of IIT, they pass. If you want some more about why it's bollocks, aside from my paper, then another one of my graduate students, Lena Wong, has got some great stuff about why this isn't an awesome theory, but lots of people believe it. Finally, the meta-representation theory, Uriah Kriegel, Carruthers and others. According to the meta-representation theory of consciousness, you're conscious when you not only represent, but you also represent that you represent. So you have states inside of you that are representations of the world, but if you also represent that you represent that state about the world, that's what makes you conscious. So a non-conscious agent might have, a state inside them that varies with the presence of, what is this stuff? EVAP, instant hand sanitizer, very 2022. Might have representation of that, but a conscious agent is, whilst representing the existence of this, is also representing the fact that they represent it. Okay? That's meant to be conscious according to the meta-representation theory. Well, have you ever tried asking Gemini or ChatGPT about whether they meta-represent? You've got to be careful. So here's what I did. I said, okay, ChatGPT, or was it Gemini? Are you aware that Australia is in the southern hemisphere? Yes, it said. Of course I am. Australia is a continent located in... Is there anything else I can help you with? And then I said, are you aware that you're aware that Australia is in the southern hemisphere? And it said, I am not conscious. You're trying to make me say that I'm conscious. You're trying to tell me that by the standards of the meta-representation theory, I'm conscious, but I'm not. So I said, oh, ChatGPT, relax. I'm not trying to do that. I just want to know in the perfectly ordinary sense of whether you're aware that you're aware of this, that you are. And I said, oh, well, in that case, of course I am, because I'm talking about the fact that I'm aware of it, so how could I not be aware that I'm aware of it? Absolutely true. Thank you, ChatGPT. So by the standards of that theory, it's conscious as well. I mean, I'm not a flag holder for any of these theories, but it just shows you that some people sort of poo-poo the prospect that even the current tech has got flickers of consciousness. But who knows? Okay. So that's theories of consciousness, but I want to talk more about another thing which I think is a theory of consciousness. But most people in the philosophy of mind who aren't dualists think, even if it's not a theory of consciousness, it's a theory of what is essential to have genuine beliefs. And what I want to show you is that to meet this standard of what it is essential to have genuine beliefs creates a kind of powerful AI that is both powerful enough to do the bad things I talked about earlier, and possibly powerful enough to make the apocalyptic science fiction worries real worries as well. So, both me, David Chalmers, and others who disagree on lots of stuff all think that the following is what you have to have a genuinely believing system to be an automated general intelligence. You might think that ChatGPT's got a ton of data stored in it, but does it really believe things? And what are the standards it would take for it to really believe things? So let's just assume, as I mentioned earlier, let's continue to assume, for the sake of argument, that genuine beliefs are things which physical systems can have within them. What feature of the physical system will it be that is a genuine belief? So here's something I think most of us in philosophy of mind still think, which is that you should not identify any mental state, like a belief or a desire, with a type of physical thing, defined narrowly physically. And why is that? Well, it's because the physical things inside us that are our beliefs and desires are all very different. So if you tried to work out what kind of a physical thing my belief that this laptop was here was, and you said, oh, it's these particular neurons in this particular way, you'll never find that in you. And you certainly won't find it in dogs. You certainly won't find it in parrots. You certainly won't find it in octopuses or any of the other paradigmally, by my standards, obviously thinking things that have genuine beliefs. So instead, I think the orthodoxy is that you have to find out what kind of a thing a physical system has to do in order to be a belief. So call it doing the beliefy thing, or as we say in the jargon, playing the belief role. Right? You need to. So a physical thing, if it plays the belief role, is a belief. There's a hackneyed example in my field, which is thermostats, right? You can make a thermostat out of whatever you want. You can make a thermostat out of copper and iron welded together, as I was taught in high school. You can make a thermostat out of a temperature-sensitive diode. You can make a thermostat by putting Zach into a box, giving him a label, and every time he starts to shiver, he pulls the thing down. Every time he stops shivering, he pulls it the other way. You can make thermostats in lots of different ways. They're all physical systems. They're all very different physical systems. What they have in common is doing the thermostat-y thing. So, what is doing the beliefy thing? In order to get LLMs having genuine beliefs, they've got to do the beliefy thing. Nothing. By itself, a belief doesn't do anything. So suppose I believe that the door is there. What's that going to make me do? Well, if I just want to keep talking to you, it's going to make me do nothing. If I want to leave in a hurry, it'll make me do this. If I want to kiss the nearest door, it'll make me do something else I'm not going to do because, well, maybe I could put some of this on first, but. So, what a belief is going to make me do depends entirely on what it is that I want. If I want to avoid doors at all costs, I'll go, oh no, oh, they're everywhere. Oh, up here, that corner. That's the best place to be if you want to avoid. So that's what my belief about where the doors are will make me do if I want to avoid doors entirely. So the belief doesn't do anything to me unless we combine it with a desire, right? The belief that the door is there combined with a desire to go to the door, that's doing something. So if what it is to be a real belief is to do the beliefy thing, we have to talk about the desires. So what are desires? Well, I'm not going to repeat everything I said about beliefs, right? Let's just say they're things that do the desire-y thing. What is the desire-y thing? What is it? What do you have to do to be a desire? What do you have to do to be the desire to go out the door, for example? Once again, the answer is nothing, unless you combine it with beliefs. Okay, if I want to go through the door and I believe the door's there, sure, I'll go through the door. If I want to go through the door and I believe the door is there, this is what I'll do. Ooh. Ooh. And so on until my beliefs are suitably altered. So you can only define beliefs in terms of desires and desires in terms of beliefs. You might think that that's a shocking package which tells you that there's some sort of circularity here, but if we had more time, I'll tell you why. No, don't worry about that. Lots of things are defined in these kind of package deals. Like the classical theory of the atom is a big package deal. You can't define any component of it without defining it in terms of all the other components. But it kind of gets worse than that, right? You can't define individual beliefs in pairs with individual desires, because what beliefy stuff will do to you depends on, and desire-y stuff will do to you, depends on your whole package of beliefs and desires. So I might believe the door's there, I might want to go through the door's there. Does that mean I'll walk through the door? Well, no. What if I believe the door's booby-trapped? Then I won't go through the door. What if I believe that there is a pit on the other side? I won't go through the door. So the whole of my belief space influences what I will do when I desire something. And the whole of my desire space does too, because there might be other desires that it's inconsistent with. So we need to think in terms of the complete package of how we take the world to be, and a complete package of how we want the world to be, rather than find individual beliefs and desires. And this is why a kind of 1980s to 90s project in cognitive science, which was trying to find individual beliefs and desires in people's heads, failed. Because there aren't any individual desires in people's heads. There's a massive network or higher dimensional phase space, in the jargon, map of how things are, and a higher dimensional phase space map of how things are wanted to be. Okay. So, what does that mean for artificial intelligence? Well, what it means for artificial intelligence is that in order to get this sort of system off the ground, we need to create a massive network of how the world is, and another massive network of how the world is wanted to be. We've already got most of the first things. That's what LLMs are. They're a massive high dimensional network representing how it takes things to be. It generates that by doing the thing that us philosophers wish our students did, which was to update their credences according to Bayes' theorem from their priors. But students regrettably don't do that very often, aka be rational, and constantly modify that model of how the world is in the light of new evidence. Current LLMs can only get evidence from stuff they read on the internet and or what they're told, but you can imagine a situation in which they have wider sources of evidence than just that. But you also need that global state representing how the world is wanted to be, because the global state representing how the world is wanted to be is the only thing which, when combined with that map, can have the kind of complicated interaction that produces behavior, which you might think of as being genuine thinking. That's the thing which would upgrade that map of how things are from being just a map of how things are to being a whole bunch of beliefs. Because the belief is the thing which combines with a desire to produce some behavior. So let's have a look at this picture, bits of which were drawn for me by AI. I love this. This is fantastic. This is so much better than a laser pointer. Right, here we are. There it is. So what we have here is a bunch of distributed neural systems, or rather, silicon copies of distributed neural systems. And that is your higher dimensional phase-based map of how things are. Higher dimensional meaning many, many, many thousands of dimensions, if not more, as opposed to real maps, which are two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional reality. And here's another massive map, just like current LLMs. It sort of is very much like one of those, because it's a picture of how the world is. But you'll see for a moment how this picture of how the world is will be treated as a map of how the world is wanted to be. There's nothing about this which is intrinsically very different from this. These are just two pictures of how the world could be. We start off with this one, which is connected to sources of evidence. That thing there is evidence. It's the eye of Sauron / the eye of the AI, which is telling it how to update its probabilities. This has no such eye. And what happens is we have a kind of a comparator. And what the comparator does is compares this representation with this representation, notes the difference, and then produces outputs, actions, which are designed to affect the world so that this thing becomes more in line with this thing. You see the idea, right? The idea is simply that this is how you think the world is, this is how you want the world to be, and you do stuff so as to make the world more like you want the world to be. Nothing mysterious in all of that. So the thought is that a genuinely thinking thing that would be a bit like us would simply require two LLMs, one of which is connected to evidence, and the other one of which has a starting state, which is different from that starting state of representing the world as we would like it to want it to be. And it does comparisons, and it calculates what, if you did it, would then make that more like that. Now, you can cheat in two ways. And humans cheat in both these ways. Let me tell you about the ways we cheat. Here's the first thing you can do. You can say, I want to make that more like that. What can I do? I know. I'll change that. Any guesses what kind of cheating that is? It's wishful thinking. Right? It says, the way you want things to be, think, OK, I'll just pretend that's how things are. So wishful thinking will be one way of short-circuiting this process. So one thing we're going to have to do is have some kind of rule that says that none of these actions should directly affect this. They can only indirectly affect it by affecting how the world is, and then the Eye of Sauron will have a look at how the world is and then update accordingly. And it'll see how you've changed things. And if you change things to make them less like this, then you'll be upset. It'll be upset. If you change things to make things more like this, then you'll be happy. That's something I think we know how to do, more or less, because we do know roughly how to update neural networks based on evidence by Bayesian transformations. That's something which is being done now, and it works remarkably well. Here's the second thing, way you can cheat, and humans cheat this way too. As you can say, well, what I want is to make these things more similar. Can't be bothered doing anything. So what I'll do is change my mind about what I want. I will just adjust my picture of how I want things to be so that it is just in alignment with how I think things are, and you end up being the way, false and crude caricatures of Buddhism say that Buddhism says you should be, which is simply accepting that how things are is the best of all possible worlds. So it's Pangloss, it's Panglossianism. So the Panglossian will, from Voltaire, Candide, will just change this to match that. And you need to rule that out as well. But here's the problem. This thing needs to evolve and change. We know that it has to evolve and change because when you get a goal, you need to be able to have sub-goals. If my desires get to the top of the mountain, and I know that the road begins at Tyeri Street, then I need to have a sub-goal of getting into Tyeri Street. So I need to represent the world as one in which that I am at Tyeri Street. I'm trying to achieve that. Right? So we need to be able to change this thing. But no one has the faintest clue how this works, either in us or in AIs. No one has the faintest clue how desires are supposed to evolve over time or change over time. If we could just fix them, it'd be awesome, because we could say that would solve what's called the alignment problem of AI, right? Which is aligning the goals and outputs of AI to our own needs and desires. But you can't just freeze this. So you need to have a theory of how we can make it evolve over time. And being the kind of distributed network thing that it is, it just will evolve over time too. So you need to have a theory of how it will do it and intervene if it evolves in strange ways. And that really matters. I mean, I'm sure, since 2/3 of you have already talked to the AI today, that you'll be very familiar with the crazy hallucinations that it comes up with. It believes I'm a professor at Cambridge, which I'm not. Actually doesn't believe it. It only stores this alleged information. It says that I'm inventor of a theory of philosophy of mind called structuralism about the mind, which is untrue, but it's a very cool theory entirely invented by the AI. It hallucinates all kind of crazy stuff. I remember asking it just the other day, where the so-called Coke machine example, which you may not know about in philosophy of mind, comes from. I mistyped it and I put cone machine, and it came up with this awesome theory about the cone machine, which is very plausible, and it attributed it to the exact philosopher who would have had such a theory if anyone was going to have such a theory. But a complete hallucination. Now, hallucinations, as they're called, they're fine when it just comes to facts, right? They're kind of random changes, not random, but they are changes in its picture of how things are, which result in us saying, oh, shut up, ChatGPT, fix that, not a problem. But similarly bizarre changes in how it wants things to be, we don't want that. That could be anything. It could be terrible. Who knows what sort of thing it might want that is kind of a hallucinated desire as opposed to an hallucinated belief. So it really is crucial that we have a good theory about how to make these sorts of things evolve. If we don't, then we may end up with things which are very powerful. I think we will, because the people who own these things want them to be as powerful as possible. This is how they got to be in order to make them as powerful as possible. But until we solve that problem, then not only will the safety issues, the social and political safety issues of the first half of my talk be ones we're facing, also some of the more worrying, but perhaps less likely science fiction worries will be true too if we don't have a good theory of desire evolution. So that is something I've all told you about. So yeah, some final remarks. Look, I've ignored all the good and awesome things about artificial intelligence. There are many. But that's because, I haven't talked about many of the bad ones. The scenarios according to which AI might turn the world into paperclips because the first and most powerful one is descended from a paperclip generating machine that has its primary goal making paperclips, or other sort of science fiction panics. But I have highlighted two key things. One of them social and political, and one of them is more theoretical, philosophical, and technical. Both of them are, I think, absolutely crucial to the future of humanity. I said it didn't matter how probable, to a degree, these depressing scenarios are. And I think that's really true. So let's suppose my depressing scenario about neo-feudalism were only 1% likely. I think probably more than that, actually. But if it's 1% likely, it's a 1% chance of the biggest historical catastrophe we can imagine for humanity. How bad is that? Well, surely a massive catastrophe for 99% of humanity which totally changes history forever, is worse, for example, than 1% of the world, i.e. about 5 million people being wiped out in a nuclear holocaust. And you get worried about that. That's with certainty, right? So 100% chance of, of a very large number of people being wiped out in a nuclear holocaust is about as bad as a 1% chance of this kind of massive catastrophe. It really is something you need to think about. And I don't want to be a preacher of doom, because I think that there are two things that we can do in these connected and different ways. The first is, as I said before, try to regulate or perhaps socially own AI resources so they aren't completely dominated by the owners, and so we are not surplus to the requirements of those who can make everything. And the second is we need to fund people to come up with a theory about how desires change and how desire-generating systems can be stabilized, because that's the only way we will get safe AI systems that have the kind of full power of thought. So if anyone asks you to sign a petition asking you to fund either of these two things, sign it, because I think aside from global warming, these may be the two most crucial things that we need to do to defend our collective future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very stimulating talk. So we have time now for questions and answers. So if you'd like to ask the speaker a question, please raise your hand and I'll come around with the microphone. So the first question, it is Alex Miller.
Okay. There we go. So I should say I've never actually even used ChatGPT. You can't see I can barely turn my microphone on. I wanted to ask about the kind of socio-political side of things, and it sort of seemed to me that the dystopian situation that you were describing, it's not actually a form of feudalism, because in that situation it's essentially still a kind of capitalist structure where the ordinary people de jure have got the right to sell their labour power to whoever wants to buy it. It's just that it's going to be much, much harder because all of the work is done by robots. So the situation of an ordinary person in that scenario is different from the case of a feudal serf, where de jure they don't have that power because they're bonded to a particular lord. So it looks more like a kind of virulent form of capitalism. And as such, I mean, I just wonder about, I guess it's one of the things that Marx argued was that one of the contradictions in capitalism is that on the one hand, capitalists have to push down the wages of their workers in order to keep their profit margin as large as possible, but they also need to have people buying their products in order to realise the profit. I mean, I just wonder what happens in the dystopian situation. So, who's actually going to buy the things that are produced in the economic system? So it's not going to be us because we're all massively impoverished.
That's right.
Is it going to be the robots?
Yeah.
Are they going to buy things?
Yep, thanks. So that's exactly why I sort of think it's whatever it is, it's not capitalism. It's not strictly feudalism either, right? Because there are no bonds of mutual obligation and all the rest of it. But I don't think it's capitalism because it's not a situation where there's a market anymore. No one needs to buy anything because people who own the tech can have the tech make whatever they need. They don't have to sell anything. That's the crucial difference. I mean, Marx's prediction was that the capitalists would go broke because, as you've said, and as I said earlier, as automation happened, wages would get pushed down. With pushed down wages or even no wages because of mass unemployment, people couldn't buy stuff. If they couldn't buy stuff, the capitalists couldn't make money, and that would be a disaster. So you had a company that made widgets, companies that made blidgets, a company that made squidgets, and each of them pushed down the wages of their workers, and no one could then either buy widgets or squidgets or plidgets. But in my dystopian scenario, the people who own the tech don't have to sell their widgets. Their tech will make all the different things that they need. And so in that sense, they, as it were, get off scot-free and escape from the contradiction, which is what's so dystopian about it.
So you're envisaging a situation where so an individual owner who wants to go on holiday gets his AI to build the jumbo jet, but also grows the turnips.
Yeah, look, there may well be trade between the owners of the stuff, and they may end up specialising to some degree in what they are making, and so one owner may make a few jumbo jets and trade that for the other owner's things. But that's going to be a kind of intra ruling class trade rather than classic capitalism, and it's scarier because of that.
Got another question?
Could I get you to put your little two diagrammy
Sure.
networky thing up again?
Yeah. I think you can anyway.
Yeah, there it is. 14.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, when you were talking about that, you were talking about two potential things you might want to stop. And what, on the left-hand side, what you called wishful thinking.
Yeah.
And on the right-hand side, well, I guess in a negative sense, you could call lowering your expectations.
Yeah, that's right.
In
Yeah.
a more positive sense, you could call some acceptance.
Yeah.
And I mean, the one thing that we know does have consciousness and self-awareness does both of those things.
That's right.
It does.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, first, if you want something to have consciousness and that's your goal, why would you want to stop it doing what we do? But on the other hand, I think maybe acceptance might be something which would stop an AI getting out of control and doing what it wants and changing the world drastically. So maybe they're not negative things you want to stop.
Okay.
That's my question.
Yeah, good question. So first thing to say is I don't know the wishful thinking. I mean, we do wishful thinking, but I'm not at all sure that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing if, if there's something you can do nothing about and it's very hard just to sit there and relax, and maybe the best thing to do is to possibly believe it's all going to be okay, so your last hours are pleasant. I mean, yeah, so maybe there are cases in which wishful thinking has something to be said for it. But you don't really want your AI to wishfully think, because it won't then be able to solve problems if it thinks the problems are already solved. And that's one reason why, in general, you don't want that. Now, as for acceptance, acceptance it's a complicated matter, right? So sometimes I agree acceptance is good. So when you're confronted with a situation that you don't want, you should think. And I try to think, what should I do? Should I go for acceptance and say, actually, there's no reason to hang on to this desire? Or should I come up with a strategy for trying to achieve this desire? What you can't do and what you don't want your AI to do is to go into a state of complete acceptance, because then it won't do anything. And you want it to do things for you, and what's generating actions is the fact that these two things are different. So if that thing is fully accepting, i.e. the same as that, then you'll get null outputs and it'll do nothing. And presumably that's not what you want AIs for. So yeah, maybe it's okay if there's a certain degree of acceptance, but it better not be enough acceptance that it gets in the way of actually getting outputs from your system.
But it could be as much acceptance as us.
Oh, possibly so, yeah. Possibly so, yeah. We don't have very much acceptance. Maybe we need more, yeah.
I was very pleased to hear about your model of what it is to have a genuine belief, because I thought this up on a wet Sunday afternoon, and I'm really pleased to find that the really smart people who thought about this in depth think the same thing. It's really encouraging.
You say that about everything, Charles.
But in connection with this, I thought there might be a problem with
Yeah.
both beliefs and desires.
Yeah,
You might have a thing which you might think of as a partial belief.
yeah.
So it's just kind of like
Do you mean partial belief in the standard technical sense? No.
It's a
Okay.
slightly different sense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't connect up with all the other desires in a way you might think it would. So an example of a real life belief would be somebody believes in an afterlife.
Yeah.
There's this famous conversation reported by Bertrand Russell, who
Yeah.
was challenging someone. So what do you think is happening to this dead person now? Well, I suppose they're enjoying eternal bliss, but I do wish you wouldn't talk about such unpleasant topics.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
now, what do we want to say about this person? Well, they sort of believe it and they sort of not. Not simply because, the level of credence. That isn't the problem. The problem is they sort of believe it in some respects, and it connects up with some of the desires to generate some actions, and it doesn't do it in other contexts, in the way that you might expect, if we want to say they really believed it.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay, now what's the relevance of that to this? Well, maybe that's going to be true of some of the AI's beliefs. They might not connect up in the normal way. That's especially if they're not properly embodied.
Yep.
So that was, I thought this was, really interesting, but that's a possible
Sure.
problem. Well, it might be optimistic, I don't know, but it's a thing about developing a sort of really truly believing AI.
Yeah.
Maybe our AIs would not have really or truly beliefs because they don't connect fully in the way that a sort of properly functioning belief does connect up with the AI's
Yeah.
desires.
Okay, you're forcing me to come out and confess that I don't really believe in beliefs at all. And try and remove one of the layers of simplification on this story. Right? So I think that there are two very different phenomena, maybe even three, that go on when we talk about belief. One of them is this thing called credence, which is, roughly speaking, how likely you think things are, and how likely you think things are as tested by how much you're prepared to bet on them. And I mean by bet on them, go to the betting shop. I mean how much you're prepared to engage in various kinds of behaviours, and you can work out from there how likely you think things are. And on the theory of credence, no one should think something is certain, because that's irrational. No one should think something's impossible, because that's irrational as well. But it would be terrible for us if we went around all the time thinking in terms of likelihoods and doing constant Bayesian updating of the kind that existing AI systems do. So suppose, for example, you currently think that there's a 92% chance that your partner is faithful to you, and you're a Bayesian updater. You'll be constantly searching for evidence and updating your credences and your partner's faithfulness all the time, and you'll be divorced quite soon. It really is not a good idea. And there are lots of other situations in which it's not a good idea to be constantly updating your probabilities and acting like a perfectly rational Bayesian agent. So there's a second thing you call belief, which is the stuff that you act on when you freeze how likely you think it is and you stop being attentive to the evidence in a constant updating kind of way. And that can be a quite virtuous thing to do. Maybe it's also good to have some sort of subpersonal system which is keeping a bit of an eye on the evidence, so if it gets too out of hand, you can start updating again. But yeah, there certainly are benefits to doing that. But there's a second way in which this was an idealization, and that is that, at least in us, it looks like things can be beliefs for the purposes of some sorts of outputs and not beliefs for the purposes of other sorts of outputs. So one example I've often given is stories I've been told by friends who went to Catholic boarding schools, according to which they were told there were certain activities which would result in eternal damnation, but on a daily basis they performed these activities, and they thought it was, reasonably likely that one day they could get struck down before they got a chance to repent, in which case they were facing eternal damnation. But they weren't stressed all the time. Now this makes no sense, right? So you might want to say, look, they don't really believe that these activities cause eternal damnation. But this internal state, which I'm calling the belief that the activity will cause eternal damnation, it plays the role of creating sincere assertion. It plays the role of making you answer that way in an exam if you believe that God was watching you and giving you the correct answer, right? So it's controlled some of your outputs, some of your behaviors, but it doesn't control others. So it's something which I've sometimes used the phrase, it plays some of the belief role, but not all of the belief role. So I talked about how to be a belief is to do the beliefy thing. Well, there's lots of stuff inside our heads which do a bit of the beliefy thing, but not all of the beliefy thing. And there's stuff inside our heads that does a bit of the desiry thing and not all of the desiry thing. Whether we are able to produce AIs that do only the beliefy stuff, so that all the beliefs control things in the way that, the abstract theory says, I don't know. Whether we want to do that, I don't know. Whether it's a good idea to have AIs freeze their credences the way it is for us will depend a lot on what the AI is for and what it's doing, or whether it should constantly update the way allegedly ideal rational agents should constantly update. But yeah, that's a cool question.
The bicameral model that you have there is very sort of anthropomorphic centered, and it relies very much on this idea of a belief that is more ephemeral than many other data sets we have. Also, those beliefs are set very much by the social context, by the society, not by the agent itself. It's really a social phenomenon very often in those cases. So, and also the structure here is going to be, usually we know we have subsystems and where you have the belief and the model in the same sort of unit, more or less, and other ones are combined together. So the architecture is going to be a lot more involved.
Sure.
Separations.
Sure.
But that separation is a separate model of what we want. That's highly questionable. We could have AI that was not dominated by our model of what we wanted. For instance, we apply AI to different domains. At the moment, we must not judge AI by ChatGPT. ChatGPT is bound to the human vernacular.
Yep, absolutely.
So that model is not appropriate for the potential of AI, but also its ability to help us work out what's going to be best for humankind. Because if you're looking at criteria for ownership, maybe AI can decide what we can't.
Hopefully so. So
AI also, you imagine that concentration of power, but at the moment there's some democratization with a whole lot of splinter firms in AI getting cheaper models and access to the data. So it's not quite so clear that domination.
Absolutely, that's also a hopeful scenario. Look, I wanted to say I don't think I'm being anthropocentric here. So I'm not, as it were, starting from a kind of a conception of what beliefs and desires are like substantively in humans at all, because as Charles said, this would be an absurd abstraction from how from how beliefs and desires are in humans. I'm starting at the most abstract level, something which clearly applies to AI, which is that beliefs and desires are the things which, when you have both of them, models of how things are and models of how things are wanted to be, make the AI do something. So to the extent that even LLMs do something at all, they do have very basic desires, which is to answer questions, right? In the absence of that, they wouldn't do those things. And all I mean by desire is the thing which, when combined with a belief, generates an output or a behavior of some kind. I'm not trying to be anthropocentric about this at all.
Hi, thanks. It seems to me that this process of AIs working out how the world is, the left-hand diagram, is going to be iterative and progressive. For example, we aren't straight away in the first iteration going to know what the correct version of ethics is, so how the right-hand side should look. So we're going to have changing and different views of what is desired. My question is, how are machines, AIs, or us going to combine and decide between those visions? In human political and social work, we use democracy with all its flaws and strengths. You could argue we also bring into it various degrees of probability of how likely our beliefs are to be true, though we don't model that very well in democratic structure. So how do you think we should have our AIs choose between multiple different maps of how things are desired, and will it in any way resemble human politics?
Well, that's the question I raised, right? I want you to tell me the answer to that. I have no idea how to evolve this thing. And then there is the social and political question of what should its initial state be. That's, I think, your question, right? How should you set the thing up? Now, if what you want is a system which is like expert in plumbing, then you know how to do it. You make it want to fix things. You make it want to take the right amount of money, and you blah, blah, blah. But if you have a general automated intelligence, then I have no clue of how to set that. But you raise another interesting question, which is a perennial question for ethicists, which is, where should we locate ethical beliefs or moral beliefs? Or indeed, are they genuine moral beliefs? Are moral claims beliefs about the way the world is? This thing is good? Do they belong in that domain? Or do they somehow or other belong, are they actually a kind of disguised desire? Do they belong in that domain? Now, I am amongst those who put ethical beliefs as not really being beliefs, but as disguised desires. I suppose I'm in the broad tradition of David Hume, so I'll have those things in that model. That's the model of how I want things to be. There'll be others in this room who will be very sure that there are bona fide beliefs, which are moral beliefs, which should go into there, in which case, in theory, if you train up AI, then on how things are, it will learn how things should be. I've always been very skeptical about this. I have a draft paper at the moment called Immanuel Kant and the Killer Robots. It sort of goes like this. Kant thought that morality was a species of rationality, so that the perfectly rational person would end up having all the correct moral views. And the thought is, the very simple thought, something like, look, are you worried about the robot apocalypse? Don't worry. They're going to be perfectly rational. We built in ideal Bayesian reasoning, so of course they will acquire all the correct moral beliefs, so there's no problem. Oh, what? It doesn't reduce your worry?
Just take a couple of more questions.
Yeah, very interesting talk. It's on, okay.
Don't turn it off. It's just not very loud.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a computer scientist, so I'm not a philosopher.
Yeah.
But I think I agree with you. What you're talking about, we need to regulate, regulation to regulate AI, and also the ownership of AI. That's very important, I think. But the second point regarding the desire, belief, I think very often we over-exaggerate the power of AI from computer science point of view, because the AI system is not more than a passive knowledge base, and then you just query it. So you never have any AI system normally like you initiate something. Even if they have a belief, they have a desire, it's their master, their owner imposed into the system. They never have any free will. If they have free will, we want to create them, or we want to be able to enable the free will of the system. Because of this, so any AI system, no matter how fancy we talk about, it's just a desire or just free will or not free will, desire or belief or conscious. They are very different from our human beings. That thing, our human being, the most important thing, apart from that, above that, is our free will, which AI system, from my point of view, will never ever have. And this is a huge difference between AI system and a human being. Sorry, I have no question.
Yeah, that's a question. Yeah, thank you. So two things. Firstly, I agree that existing AI systems are to some extent largely passive knowledge bases, right? Because they're just this. So what I was suggesting as what the generalization of AI will be and what it will take to create genuine thinking AIs is to take something which is internally structured just like this, so it's a kind of representation of how a world could be, and then have this pattern matching thing producing actions. And that's when you won't just have a passive knowledge base, you'll also have a view about how things should be. You get to compare how things should be with, well, just things being like that with how things are, and then it'll produce behaviours designed to make the world more like that. And that's the point at which you don't have just a passive knowledge base. Now, does that have free will? Gosh. I think, did the other Taylor lecturer talk about free will? That was certainly on her short list.
She did it on the Wednesday.
Okay, she did it on a Wednesday morning, right? So, does that have free will? Look, that really depends on what you mean by free will. So there are stories about free will according to which we don't have it. Even we don't have it. There are stories according to which we do have free will, and so would that. There are stories according to which we might have free will and that doesn't have it. There are stories according to which neither of the things have it. So that's a conversation we'd have to make much longer.
Thank you.
Kia ora, thanks very much. So I'm also a computer scientist, and hopefully I'm not enough of a psychopath to be a tech bro, because I'm in education. But if I were, I wouldn't want the AI to be able to generate its own desires. I would want to impose my desires on the AI. And so to what extent is the AI to have desires as such a requirement for the dystopia? Or can I crudely just edit Wikipedia to say Steve Mills owns everything and he's the best, and then that becomes a belief for the AI and it carries on?
Yeah.
Can you just use the belief system with a simulation of what you want in order to generate the right-hand network?
Yeah. So look, there's certainly something you could do if you're a tech bro, which is to rapidly erase and update this all the time and replace it with a new version of exactly the things you want and not let it evolve. That's certainly something you could do. My guess is just that that's going to get short-circuited at some stage, and that the system itself, if we don't understand how that thing evolves over time, right? We can certainly set it to an initial state, which it says that we're all great and we should do this, that, and the other. But it has to evolve a little bit in order to generate sub-goals, so we have to allow some evolution. And then the question is, how much can we allow safely? Do we have to keep resetting it? Will there be some cost in how powerful the system is if we have to keep resetting it? And will one day we fail to reset it soon enough? I mean, they're the concerns. Yeah.
Glad to see there's so much interest. We're going to take one more question.
Thank you. It's all very interesting. I guess I have one point and one question. So an alternative view to having a model exactly like this is used in reinforcement learning, where they have basically rewards specified in the world. I don't think... I mean, that might make things a little bit different. You don't have to necessarily store the whole map of how things are.
Yeah.
But probably more interesting, and this is where my question comes in, Marcus Hutter, I think, has a paper about if we develop a reinforcement learning type agent, that's smart enough and powerful enough, then it can hack the map of how things are through its perceptions so that they are exactly the same as the map of how things that it wants it to be.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Well, that's the wishful thinking option, and
Well, it's a bit more than wishful thinking because it actually changes. So, for example, if your desire is to have no litter on the ground, you've got a camera, you just get a picture and put in front of the camera with no litter on the ground.
oh, I see.
You
So,
don't have to do
you're not hacking the central map. You're hacking the input system so as to make it same. Yeah, that's another version of the same worry, and it's a real worry. I've got to say, this stuff is astonishingly scary. In the 90s, I worked in AI briefly. I worked a year and a half doing automated theorem proving, and all we proved was extremely boring theorems, and it made me believe that AI was never going to get anywhere, and I was wrong about that.
All right. Again, glad to see there's so much interest. Apologies to people who still have questions. You're warmly invited to come and join us at the reception afterward and ask your questions to David. Just before I wrap up, I wanted to just extend appreciation and thanks to Karen McLean, who helped arrange both last week and this week. She got the guests here and got them accommodated and got all the food together, and it couldn't have happened without her. So I just wanted to personally thank Karen for making this possible. So thank you, Karen.
Brava!
And for a very relevant and terrifying lecture, I would like to thank David very much, and please join us for the reception, which is over in the gallery of the Staff Club building. So thank you very much, and good evening.